Governor Leavitt, that was fantastic. Exactly the kind of example that we're always looking for to follow. I want you all to extend a very warm welcome to my friend and colleague, Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska. Ben, come on. I always enjoy it whenever I get to introduce one group of friends to another. I have no better friend in the Senate than Ben Sasse. I first met Ben Sasse while he was running for the Senate a couple of years ago. And he came with a proud resume, an unbelievably strong academic record. He was serving as president of Midland University. He had previously served as a staff member to then Secretary Leavitt at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He laid out an ambitious policy agenda as a candidate for the U.S. Senate, and also a very ambitious campaign agenda. He promised to visit all the counties in Nebraska within just his first few months as a Senate candidate. Now, that's ambitious in almost any state. In our own state of Utah, 29 counties, it takes a lot of time to visit all 29. But if I'm not mistaken, in Nebraska, this is an especially big commitment because they have 93 counties. And so on some occasions, this resulted in Ben having to speak to hogs and ears of corn because I think there are some counties where they don't have any people.
We don't admit it, but there are some counties with 20 times as many cattle as people.
That's fantastic. But hey, those cattle are supporting people in their own way, so not to be discounted. Now, I promise not to rub this in too much, but Ben and I had a wager a few weeks back when BYU was playing Nebraska in football. Yes, in Lincoln. Now, we didn't know how this game was going to turn out, but we decided that we had to bet something interesting. And I think Ben at one point offered to bet me a case of beer, and then he realized that I'm not really into that sort of thing. So we decided that we would make it a food bet, that if Nebraska won, it was going to be my commitment to deliver Norbest turkeys to Nebraska, and they would go specifically to the Omaha Open Door Mission, which is a gospel rescue mission based in Omaha, Nebraska. And the other side of that was that if BYU somehow managed to pull off a victory, we were not the favorites at the time by any stretch, that Senator Sasse was going to deliver up Pillen Family Farm pork for the Utah Food Bank. Now, I'm not sure anyone could have predicted exactly how that game ended. You know, our star quarterback, who was coming back to regular season play after his season-ending injury about a year ago, got injured again in that game. I'm still not convinced there wasn't foul play there, but I'm not going to make any accusations about that. And at the last minute, our second-string quarterback came through for us. Tanner Mangum threw that great Hail Mary pass, or as Ben Sasse is probably calling it now, the Hail Joseph Smith pass, or whatever they want to call it.
That's right.
And we somehow pulled off the victory. And so because of that, Senator Sasse was set to bring 10 pork loins from the Pillen Family Farms to the Utah Food Bank. But in typical Ben Sasse fashion and the typical fashion of the Pillen Family Farms, they've over-delivered. Now, they actually drove to Salt Lake City from Nebraska, delivering 200 pounds of their finest pork to the Utah Food Bank, which they're going to deliver this afternoon. And by the way, our friends at Norbest have decided to deliver some turkeys anyway, just for good measure.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. In the face of all the great, kind Utah hospitality I've known over the last decade, I don't want to do anything to lower expectations, but I do feel obliged to note that Nebraska's 2-4 for the first time since 1958. And we kind of hold this against some of you for starting this trend. For those of you who aren't watching the college football season closely, we're not just 2-4. We've lost all 4 games on either the very last play, losing the lead, or the second to last play. So the play that you're talking about, we call it Hail Joseph Smith in Nebraska, was a 42-yard touchdown pass as time expired. 2 weeks later, we lost at Miami in overtime on basically the same play. We lost last week at Illinois by giving up a touchdown with 4 seconds left. that went the length of the field in 51 seconds for 79 yards. And then this weekend, we lost on a last-second field goal. But other than that, we're not bitter.
Never, of course not. No, Ben and I were texting throughout this game. And at one point during the game, I was telling him, I was issuing a preliminary note of congratulations, saying, looks like you probably got this wrapped up. And then as we pulled it off, I started, talking smack. But Ben is one of the few people that you can have this kind of back and forth football exchange with. And then he can also turn it into something very intellectual. As I was growing sort of prideful at the very end of the game, he warned me against the evils of theological triumphalism and promised to have a true fact.
Which is hard to get your texting device to auto spell check, I gotta admit.
Turns out not a lot of folks text about that. But Ben, I was wondering if you could share with this group a little bit about some of the things that you've learned as a comeback technician. When you headed up Midland University, it was a turnaround operation. This was not easy. Why don't you share with us a little bit about that story and some of what you learned in it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Senator. And to all of you, this is a very interesting state. I promise I won't spend too much time fawning over the man who's known as the idea factory of Washington, D.C., but I do learn a ton from Mike Lee. But I've also gotten to know your state a good bit over the last 9 or 10 years because of the last guy, who I'm a huge fan of, and then somebody sets me up on an agenda to have to follow Mike Levitt's tear-jerking conclusion with the 5-year-old kid, which doesn't feel like great hospitality because you can't possibly match that. But I've learned a lot from many of you in this room and many of the folks that are on Governor Levitt and Senator Lee's team, so pleasure to be here. I'm 43. My wife says, look 33, act 23 too much of the time, but I have never really had a long-term durable job. I've done crisis and turnaround projects for most of my 21 adult years, and I think that the reason that's a little bit relevant to the college story is because I think the new economy that we're entering into is going to be a new normal where freelance nation or free agent nation is going to be much more common than long-term durable one-employer relationships. And it means that all of us are going to need to develop the skills, not just as Governor Levitt was talking about, of collaboration, but fundamentally the ability to think about that distinction between best practices and first principles redesign, because so many of our organizations are going to need to be rebuilt and recreated every few years for the rest of history anyway. And so I won't spend a lot of time here, but maybe a little bit later I'll make some comments on some of what I think is happening in the disintermediation of the economy, but how it related to my college turnaround experience. My wife and I have 3 little kids. We moved back to Nebraska about 7 years ago to be raising our kids near grandparents and aunts and uncles and fundamentally ag labor. I'm sure in Salt Lake you have theories on how to raise your kids with character. Where we're from, you have to walk beans or detassel corn at 5 a.m. if your kids aren't going to end up in a juvenile delinquency institution. So we had moved home to raise our kids there, and there's this 130-year-old liberal arts college in my hometown. And my parents met there. I grew up going to sports camps there. My grandpa, who never went to college but came back from World War II and worked at this college for 35 years. My family history is really interwoven with this school that was then called Midland Lutheran College, a 130-year-old institution. And we had moved back to Nebraska, and in fall of 2009, we found out that they were likely going to declare bankruptcy. And this just seemed inconceivable. This was like the physical, architectural pillar of the community that I'm from. And I was asked, because I'm a turnaround guy, I have a lot of history with this institution, and I lived 5 miles away, I was asked to take a look at their books and their operation. And when you went in, and I was just doing this as a volunteer, I had 0 plans or aspirations to be a college president at this point. When you went into the college, the first thing you found is that 84% of their kids majored in only 7 departments, though they had 45. They had 38 academic majors that functionally didn't have students and had not just underemployed, but in many cases functionally unemployed faculty. And yet there was almost nobody empowered in the institution to ask the fundamental question, well, if the number one way we're spending our money is on salary and benefits for tenured faculty members, literally the biggest expenditure of the institution was for parts of the school that didn't have any customers, didn't have anybody that was benefiting from the labor of those people. We had to tackle the moral challenge, not just of what bankruptcy would look like, but how after you went bankrupt, could you look back at the donors and at the students who were going to have to transfer in the middle of the year and at the faculty and staff who are going to be out of a job and say, we never thought to actually ask the hard questions about what rebuilding this place would look like. And I think those kinds of questions are becoming less and less crisis management questions and more the questions of all good governance for most organizations in an era of more rapidly transitioning organizations.
Do you see some parallels between what you faced in that position and the position you face today?
You know, there are remarkable similarities between organizations that tend to believe that the missional aspect of what they have frees them from having to have actual accountability to numbers and budgets, and the way governments, which are inherently monopolistic institutions, tend to approach problems, because in both cases, the idea of being disintermediated, the idea of being bankrupted is not sort of a day-to-day concern. Governments don't think about the world that way. Who could come in and deliver the services we're delivering cheaper? Not-for-profits don't tend to think that way. But I think one of the greatest parallels about them is the human capital problem of not constantly thinking, who are we and what is our mission and who benefits from us, and then what sort of inputs do we need? We don't exist as a government, and college or any other charity shouldn't exist chiefly as a jobs program. It should chiefly exist because of the missional aspect of what it seeks to accomplish, and then you figure out how to draw people into that mission. And obviously, as you and I commiserate over lunch many days, many aspects of the government we're a part of it right now is on autopilot and not thinking fundamentally enough about what does this institution need to do to empower and enable other people to go out and live high and fruitful callings in an environment of ordered liberty.
So in the case of higher education, I would imagine that the government is sometimes part of the problem. Do you see other areas where the government might be part of the problem, perpetuating problems that might go unaddressed for many years because of bad government policy?
I'm not sure where the question came from for Governor Leavitt, but some of the question about standards and about essentially curricular aspirations, and fundamentally things that you have a legislative initiative around, accreditation is a basic question of how do we get at this distinction between the public aspects of education that are governmental and the parts that aren't necessarily governmental. And to me, the distinction here is between public funding and public management. We clearly believe that one of the purposes of government is to make sure we invest sufficiently in things that have positive externalities. And by that I mean, when you invest in employees, when you invest in job training programs, when you invest in the intellectual and educational development in the K-12 environment, more and more states referring to it as the P16 environment right now, I put a little asterisk of dissent on that. I worry about the transition of higher education to a grades 13 to 16 logic, because I don't think it puts enough onus on students coming of age to take ownership for their own learning and to begin to distinguish between their intellectual development, which needs to be lifelong, and their job retraining aspects, which get at some of these questions about technical investments that we need to make. But one of the things that we don't do well, once we agree with the broad assumption that any individual employer or any individual family might not have the resources to invest enough in a student or in a worker to capture all the benefits that society will get from that empowered, enabled worker over the course of a lifetime, is that doesn't mean because we believe in public funding, we should believe in monopolistic delivery, where you don't have the opportunity for competition. And I think that the credentialing regime that exists right now, for those of you who are close to higher education, you'll know that the federal government essentially grants 10-year-long monopolies to 5 regional not-for-profits. I don't know who would accredit here. Are you WASC or
Northwest.
Higher Learning Commission? Okay, Northwest. So where we live in Nebraska, we're a part of the Chicago territory, the Higher Learning Commission of the North Central States Association, just to make it as bureaucratic and Orwellian sounding as possible. Essentially the middle third of the country by land mass, but not fully by population, you need accreditation from one of these accrediting bodies of the government to be sure that your students can get Perkins loans, Stafford loans, Pell Grants, and take that portable money with them. In theory, that sounds great. It's a quality control mechanism to be sure that the government's investments in public education are having long-term human capital benefits for the public. The danger of it is that these accrediting regimes tend to look at what the problems are that existed 10 and 15 and 20 years ago and try to make sure that organizations don't do fraudulent things that would tap the public fisc, public monies, for problems that they're trying to solve retrospectively. And they have a really difficult time of looking toward the future. And one of the things we know about the future, how many of you know what Khan Academy is? Maybe a third of you, 40%. I'll just give a tiny brief commercial and then urge you as a homework assignment over the next week. Khan is Khan. Check out the Khan Academy on YouTube or online. Salman Khan is a guy who is Indian American, who was, I think, doing private equity in Northern California. And he was good at school. He was nerdy, overachiever, like many of the people in this room, like many of us. And Salman Khan had a niece, I think, living in Cleveland, and she was having trouble. He talked to his sister, and his niece was having trouble mastering algebra. She was an 8th or a 9th grader, and she couldn't learn algebra. And he thought, how could this be? Algebra is fascinating. I'll teach her algebra. We'll just figure out how to do it. And he put up a whiteboard in his office and a little camera, and he decided to ask his sister, mail me a copy of her algebra textbook, and I'll tutor her every night in algebra. Some days it'd be a 5-minute lesson, some days it'd be a 20-minute lesson, and he realized that emailing her these files, these video files of himself teaching his niece algebra was a pretty inefficient delivery model. And so he started taking these 5 to 20-minute lectures, and he started just uploading them onto the internet. And over the course of a few months, and I don't know the exact timeline, so don't quote me here, but they started finding that not just thousands, but tens of thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands, and now many of these videos have millions of viewers. He was becoming, and I'm not overstating this, he was becoming the most influential algebra teacher in the history of the world as one guy in an office building for 5 minutes at night because he cared about his niece. And he was impassioned about algebra. And he wasn't just teaching his niece, he was teaching everybody else who was going on Khan Academy. Pretty soon the Gates Foundation and others persuaded him to quit his job. And he started going up from algebra into geometry and trigonometry and calculus. And then he started going sideways into physics and all these other disciplines. And what you realized was there are many things that are individual in our learning, that are tutorial in our learning. And there are many other things that 1 to a million or 1 to 10 million isn't really any different than 1 to 30. And if you're the best algebra teacher for your niece, you might be the best algebra teacher to the world. And the scale of this is completely transformed by the nature of modern IT and telecommunications. And so what we find is that in the higher education and crediting environment, everybody is still looking at the world like every problem is the same problem that colleges of 25 and 30 years ago before IT faced. And in reality, that's not true. When we teach accounting at the college that I was at, sorry to go a little long-winded on this one, but I'm a bit passionate about what blended learning is going to look like in the future, because I don't even think we're able in the public sector to envision what many families and IT entrepreneurs and innovators are envisioning for 5 and 10 years from now. We at our college had accounting as one of those big majors. I said we had 45, and a lot of our students, a hefty majority, majored in only 7 of them. One was business with a kind of accounting focus. And one of the things we prided ourselves on is where the University of Nebraska taught accounting, freshman year accounting, at about a 300 to 1 ratio. We taught it at a 40 to 1 ratio. The professor taught you in a class of only 40 students. Well, that sounds good until you actually get inside the classroom and think about it a lot. And it turns out most 40 to 1 classes aren't really that different than 300 to 1 classes. There are 5 nerdy kids who are overachievers relative to the rest of the class, who tend to ask all the questions, and that becomes the feedback loop for the professor, who then thinks he or she knows what the students are learning or not learning. And whether or not it's 295 kids being left behind or 35 kids being left behind, it still wasn't the intimacy of a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-3 kind of tutorial model. And I think what the future is going to hold in accounting, and there's some data to show that this is probably the best way kids learn certain subjects. I would distinguish it between theology and maybe literature and fundamental writing skills. But accounting, something that is not going to impact your worldview, there are things that if you do them at a 1,000,000 to 1 ratio are no worse than 30 to 1, and they're a heck of a lot cheaper, and they're probably going to be higher quality because no professor is going to be bad at a 1,000,000 to 1 and not be found out. And at 30 to 1, they might be. And we supplemented going from 40 to 1 to much larger scale for some of our accounting, down to 3 to 1 in tutorials for a lot of the other stuff. And then we blended that with high frequency, low stakes quizzing, where you start to figure out who's doing the work and what are they bottlenecking on, and you can start to individually tailor the lessons. That kind of problem, which is being discovered accidentally around extracurricular, after-school programs, around homeschooling networks, around IT innovators, around the Salman Khans of the world. That kind of innovation in blended learning with more seminars and dense tutorials and more large mediated high-tech delivery systems, that kind of hybridization, the accreditation regimes are not at all prepared for. And so a lot of the higher quality, lower cost delivery mechanisms of the future are going to have a hard time breaking through the barriers to entry unless we find ways to make sure government doesn't create and exacerbate the barriers to entry of extant players. We want to allow new innovators into these spaces.
So our accrediting bodies are themselves not ready for it. They're not accustomed to it. They're built on the, what do they call it, the Carnegie unit, the 50-minute hour of classroom instruction. I assume that behind that means that our laws are also not up to speed for it. What kinds of changes to our legal system do you anticipate that we ought to undertake, at least the way we treat institutions of higher learning from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, so I don't think I know the answer yet. I'm obviously new. I've never been in politics before. I'm my 9th month in the job. But both Senator Lee and Senator Marco Rubio have a bunch of ideas about how we can re-envision the credentialing regime. And one of the things I think we need to be aware of is the fact that what we think of today as colleges and universities, I think nominally there are about 5,000 four-year higher ed institutions in the country, but about 2/3 of those tend to be very narrow, tailored, specific institutions. So there might be a culinary institute somewhere that delivers a 4-year degree. It's not what you think of in your head as a generalist 4-year institution. There are about 1,600 of these generalist 4-year institutions in the country. And we still tend to think, when you think of a college kid, of an 18 to 22-year-old that's going to school full-time, that's going to graduate in 4 years, that they don't have outside employment that's of any significance, maybe they're doing 10 hours or 15 hours a week somewhere, and that they're residential on that campus. It turns out that's well under 1/5 of all the students in higher education in America. More than 80% of the students in higher education are a 28-year-old mom who went to school for a 1.5 years, 8 years ago, and then had a baby and had a marriage and started work, and now she's trying to, at nights and weekends, finish a job, but she has credits from a community college somewhere, and she's moved to a new geography, and she's switching to a new major, and she's nominally a sophomore, but partly been in school over the course of the last, 8 of the last 10 years. She surely is never going to be residential full-time in school again. That kind of model, the portability and the transitional nature of higher education sounds kind of broken. At one level you think, well, that's troubling. I wish everybody could have this idyllic experience of being at Nebraska for a football game unless we lost on a Hail Mary last-second play. The sort of vision we have of the romantic, idyllic college environment, that's really not what higher education is going to be for most of society, for most of the future, because a lot of people are going to be disintermediated from their jobs every 3 or 4 years for the rest of their lives, and every second or third time they may need to be retrained. And so I think we have to self-consciously admit that the accreditation regimes, I don't want to quite use the word cartel, but it applies some of the time, we need people to be able to mix and match credits from lots of different institutions, and those are going to be different types of institutions. Densely residential institutions, commuter institutions, partially blended and online institutions, and fully online institutions. And to flag something that Governor Leavitt is a big champion of, we need to get to a place where much more of this has a flavor like Western Governors University, where there's ultimately a credentialing regime that is mapped onto actual competency demonstration. The accreditation world is not at all ready for the nature of what our economy and our human capital is going to need in the future.
So it used to be that in order to get higher education experience, you had to go to a place. You had to be a resident there. You had to have books and professors and classrooms and students all within the same space, all within the small universe of the college or the university. So Oxford University was created, 1,000 years ago or something like that. That was certainly the case 1,000 years ago when Oxford was started, and it was the case even 100 years ago, 130 years ago when Midland University was created. It is no longer an inescapable fact that will have to always be in place. And so we've got these innovations that have taken place. I assume you would agree that none of this is ever going to replace the brick and mortar university. That's not going to become a white elephant. It's not going to become obsolete.
I don't think it will, and there are good reasons why we need these densely coming-of-age transitional institution life. But maybe, I'm a historian by training. I've done crisis strategy for 21 years, and my mom is constantly harping on, why did you waste all those years getting a history PhD? And so now I see an opportunity right here, so I'm going to seize it. I'm going to do a 2-minute history lesson since you asked if the brick and mortar institution's eternal. I think it's worth just reflecting on where colleges and universities as mass institutions came from. Sure, Oxford University really has only existed since about the mid-19th century, but colleges clustered around Oxford have existed for almost 1,000 years. There are now 35-ish colleges at Oxford. There were a dozen of them by 400 or 500 years ago, and they were just separate institutions in the same town. Well, why were they there? Because there were a bunch of people who knew how to read and write there, and because they had a big library, and pre the Gutenberg press, people didn't own books. And so if you wanted to learn something, you had to go to a place where there were books and where there were people who could help you understand what was in those books. But as a mass institution, higher education is something that's commonly a part of everyone's experience, not just people headed for the ministry or the very rich, landed, leisurely class. It's really a product of World War II and the GI Bill. But you can only understand that if we think about it against the backdrop of economic history. I mean, there are really only 4 kinds of economies in the history of the world. There were nomads, hunter-gatherers. We had settled agrarian farmers in the villages that those clustered around. You had the rise of cities, and in Western Europe and in North America, we think of this as chiefly an 1870 to about 1920 phenomenon. And then you have, we call that the big tool economy. And then you have whatever's happening now, right? We went from hunter-gatherer to settled agrarian farmer at a time when we didn't really have alphabets. So we know that it was surely highly disruptive. You imagine people wandering around all the time, and then somebody suggests that they build permanent structures, plant crops, and just settle there, regardless of the seasons or what animals are migrating through. Everybody thought they were crazy, right? But then when you went from settled farmers to cities, this is arguably the most disruptive time in human history until what we're entering now. And from 1870 to 1920, urbanization, immigration, industrialization, the rise of big tool economies, people leaving farms and going to cities and taking new jobs that were around this big tool that they went to work at, as opposed to them going out to where productive things were on the land or where animals were. We're now transitioning into something that is even more disruptive than that. We're going from big tool economies to an era of, sometimes we talk about it as service economy, sometimes we talk knowledge economy, IT economy. The one thing we know for sure is that as recently as the late 1970s, average duration at a firm was still nearly 3 decades. Most Americans worked for the same employer for about 3 decades at a time, just 35 years ago. Today, when I was shaking kids' hands, handing them a diploma, walking across the stage last summer as my 5th year as a college president, we knew from demographers and economists, they weren't just going to change jobs, 22-year-olds. They weren't just going to change jobs 3 times before they turned 30. They were going to change industries 3 times before they turned 30. And among those of us in this room who are a little older, a little grayer, a little more settled, our average duration at a firm now is still less than 4 years. The rise of secondary schooling as a mass experience, the idea that you would have puberty and adolescence in an institution as opposed to you already being in the workforce, that's only about 150 years old as a human idea. As recently as 1870, less than 2% of Americans were high school graduates. By World War II, it was 78%. Today, it's still about the same. The rise of secondary schooling is an echo of the rise of factory model schooling, where there was just less productive work for 12 to 18-year-olds to do. The rise of higher education is right now serving kind of a similar role in society. It's just a place for 18 to 22-year-olds to be warehoused when we don't have enough work for them to do. We don't need these to be passive institutions that accidentally extend adolescence. We need higher education to be radically innovative and a part of that every 3 to 8 year cycle for people's rest of their productive work lives. We need it to be a human capital empowering tool. Right now, they're really, really sleepy institutions, and they're not providing the value we need. I say that with lots of love and sympathy for them as institutional types, but we need a lot more radical change. Some of them will still be brick and mortar institutions. Lots more of them are going to have to be innovating in ways we can't even envision yet.
I assume there are things we can do to facilitate that, or at least to not hinder it with government. typically, if you have an industry that is where government is too involved, it can sort of, for instance, in the telephone industry, it can wed people to the rotary telephone for many decades without any innovation. I assume this is another one of those areas where we've got to be mindful of government's impact and making sure that we're not freezing a particular business model in place.
Yeah, and I want to humbly lower expectations that I know the right policy magic bullets yet, but since you bring up telecom, it's a useful analog maybe to unpack a little bit. When I used to work with the Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey and Company and have done a little bit of private equity, so I've been in a lot of sectors where when there's radical change, there's obviously scary things for people, but it's also fascinating, right? There's great innovation opportunities in moments of disruption. And in the mid-1990s, I worked with one of the regional Bell companies, and there was a new CEO coming. I was at a strategy consultancy, and the internet wasn't really something that had fully impressed itself upon us yet. We didn't really know what it was. This is early 1995. We talked a lot about e-commerce or electronic commerce and the World Wide Web. And I remember this CEO of a phone company. He was new on the job, and he hired our strategy consultancy to come in with him and help think of some of the strategic challenges he faced. And the old business model that had been locked into place by the regulatory environment that Senator Lee talks about, this CEO said, I'm scared out of my mind. I'm taking over this company. I've worked in telecom my whole life. I thought I knew what telecom was. I've aspired to become a CEO of a regional Bell rooted, lined, wired telecom company. And now I realize because of this whole internet thing, this e-commerce thing, I really don't have a clue what my job is. I'm pretty sure that we have 120,000 employees, and they don't know what, he knew they had 120,000 employees. He said, I'm pretty sure the people that I'm called to lead, they also don't really know what we are and what we're going to do. And so I want you all to help me start with 3 questions. 1, what is electronic commerce? Because I don't know what it is. None of us did, right? Number 2, what will the currency of the internet be? Because at this point, everybody imagines something like digital cash would come into being and conquer the internet in a hurry. PayPal obviously didn't exist. The idea that Visa and other credit card companies would capture with pretty high transactional rates the internet, no one thought it would have worked like that. You didn't envision a world where you'd have a firewall. You either are or aren't a subscriber to New York Times online. The assumption was if you go to the New York Times website, as you move your mouse around on their page, if you read for 5 minutes, you might owe them 0.2 of a penny. If you read for an hour, you might owe them 3.2 cents. But the assumption was there would be some way that you consume digital cash as you go. And he said strategy question 3 is, if it's true that there's convergence between phone companies and financial institutions, namely if we're going to mediate this new digital cash e-currency world, of my 120,000 employees, I have 17 divisions that tell me they have an e-commerce task force, and I need to know, do I fire 16 of the 17 or all 17 and start from scratch? How could it be that they got to a place that their CEO didn't know what the business model might be in the new world, and yet they had 17 different bureaucracies dedicated to it? They got to it because their ability to innovate had been so heavily constrained by the way the regulatory environment created their geographic footprints. And it was exactly the wrong way to foster the kind of innovation that would ultimately, I don't want to say all the regional Bell companies got their lunch eaten, because obviously subsequent mergers led to some value creation. But the idea that the innovation had to come out of Northern California and out of Utah, and not out of some of the extant players, was partly because they were fighting old battles, and some of that was because they were both preserving and being preserved by the barriers to entry that the regulatory environment created. We need to, in education, do a much, much better job for that. Our economy and the human capital of our kids and grandkids depends on it.
Thank you. Now, in the few minutes we have left, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into another area of expertise that you have, which is healthcare. You worked with Secretary Leavitt at HHS. I assume you can see some parallels between some of the challenges we face in, for example, education, higher education, and telecoms. And there are perhaps some parallels with our healthcare system, where the government's gotten heavily involved, heavily subsidized things, and yet because of the way governments work, sometimes they don't evolve as quickly or allow industry to evolve as quickly. Tell us what you think some of the policy challenges there are that government ought to be looking at.
Yeah, so I'll focus on policy challenge, but maybe I'll throw out one thought of analog first on higher education and healthcare. I'm drawn to crisis. I think it's interesting. There's things that are being broken, and there are humans who are laboring hard in those environments, and many of them are caught up in sectors that they're going to be unemployed in a hurry, and they don't see it coming. So there's an empathy draw, but there's also just an intellectual curiosity draw. Education and healthcare are arguably the only two competitors for most broken sector of the U.S. economy. What do they have in common? They're dominated by third-party payment. That third-party payment is mostly governmental, and the actual experience of success and meaningful service or product delivery in both education and healthcare is ultimately delivered by teams. We have in our mind this vision of the one sage on the stage professor who will change your life. And if you have that one person that's responsible for everything you ever learned, you're really, really fortunate, but it's not what most people have experienced. And in the same way, one rock star surgeon doesn't save your life. Coordination of care of the nurses that follow and make sure that you got all of the medications you were supposed to get and didn't have drug-drug interactions, the systemic aspects of it, and I think about some of the things that Intermountain has pioneered. What really dominates success and quality outcomes in education and healthcare is team play, but team play is really, really difficult to measure. And so we end up with a world where in both education and healthcare, we try to solve our problems by doing a lot on the push side and very, very little on the pull side, because we've disempowered the student and we've disempowered the patient, usually by assuming, somewhat in a benevolent paternalistic way, but still assuming nonetheless, that the student or the patient are actually too stupid to have much meaningful role in understanding what high quality care and high quality education looks like. And I would submit to you that the student and the patient are going to make lots and lots of mistakes, but they actually care about it a heck of a lot more than the bureaucrat somewhere far on the other side of some wall of bureaucracy that you can't get to. And so I would say that one of the biggest, most obvious problems in American healthcare is that we pretend we're talking about insurance when most of the time we're not talking about insurance. We take the words for healthcare finance and healthcare delivery and we swallow all of it underneath the word insurance. Well, let's just pause for a minute, set aside healthcare and say, well, what does insurance mean most places in life? Why do I buy an Allstate or a State Farm policy? Do I expect them to schedule my Jiffy Lube appointments? Am I trying to find a way to collectivize my expenditure on gas, regardless of whether I buy a high economy, high fuel efficiency or low fuel efficiency car, whether I drive 40,000 miles a year or 4,000 miles a year? Of course not. The reason I want property and casualty insurance is so I don't have a catastrophic loss for unexpected, unpredictable, non-behaviorally driven events. I'm 43, and the kids who were at my college a year and a half ago, the 19-year-old testosterone-laden male athletes, we don't pay the same insurance rates for property and casualty, and for good reason. I'm almost never leaving a bar at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, right? We're making lots and lots of different choices in our lives, and the actuarial impact on that informs the long-term catastrophic costs of what is actually insurance, but is not trying to have the insurance side run the gas station refueling and the Jiffy Lube appointment side. And if you tried to have Allstate or State Farm run all the Jiffy Lubes in America, I submit to you they won't be at the right locations, they won't be open the right hours, they won't be sure what products and services I want, they'll be a heck of a lot more expensive, the hours won't be right, and the lines will be longer. A lot like routine healthcare delivery in America. And so the number one problem in American healthcare is sadly a problem, obviously I'm an Obamacare critic and skeptic, but our purpose here is not the partisan spectrum. It's much more fundamental than that. The problem in American healthcare is that we are living on a tax accident from wage and price controls at the end of World War II, by which people are still thinking if they can launder what should be some of their wages and benefits through a tax subsidy for their insurance, they want to buy more and more and more insurance. And if you buy more and more insurance, you're going to try to run all of American healthcare delivery through the push side of my insurance company. I don't want that. Almost no one really wants that. What they want is to be insured against non-behaviorally driven catastrophic loss And then they want to be able to have a relationship with the kinds of people who can deliver routine health care, where the doctor and the nurses and the company, if I want to know my cholesterol level 3 or 4 times a year, why can I not get that at CVS for $4? Right? What most people want is the experience of a delivery system that's responsive to them. And I worry that Obamacare's biggest single problem, from the standpoint of what it's going to fix or not going to fix, not dealing with the constitutional issues here, although I could talk all day about the individual mandate and constitutional concerns that you and I share. The single biggest problem in Obamacare is it tries to let bureaucracies enshrine the essential minimum benefits package. And it says that I have to buy more insurance for everything, as opposed to a more complete distinction that the people really want between catastrophic insurance. I think Governor Levitt's helpful language was, we have a universal societal goal, not necessarily governmental goal, but we have a societal goal of universal catastrophic insurance, and we want a delivery system that can innovate in some ways that are like Moore's Law, where we can get higher quality for lower cost over time. That's never going to happen if you mediate the delivery system through the insurance structures that already existed yesterday.
Fantastic. As you may have noticed, I was taking copious notes throughout that. This is one of the things that I love about serving with this man right here. Whenever I can get Ben Sasse talking on an issue, I like to sit back and just listen and be educated, because that's what happens every time he talks. Let's give a very warm thank you to Ben Sasse, Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Thanks, dude.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. I'd next like to welcome to the stage Adam Terry with Waffle Truck. And as you're welcoming him, remember he provided the waffles for us this morning. So welcome, Adam.